All right, good. It's not the morning. All right, good day, everyone. It is now 1400 hours, I guess actually 2 after. We're going to go ahead and get started and call to order the 313 day, Detroit Day, March 13th, 2024 Audit and Finance Committee meeting. It is Detroit Day, 313 day.
Also read across America.
Oh, yeah, that's what. Read Across America Day. Yes, of course. So we're going to go ahead and call it to order. I believe we have a quorum. I invite to phone stuff. Yep, we have a quorum. So I'm going to call first for the adoption of the agenda. Do we have any thing I am not seeing? Tanisha, did we pull off the constituent board? Did we pull off the constituent board information item?
Yes, it is.
Okay, I'll bring it up on the new business. All right, so
I have some, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, I can, go ahead.
I need to fix my volume because I could barely hear you. Did you ask for the approval of the agenda?
Yeah, the agenda.
I have some items to correct.
All right.
There's approval of the minutes, the dates of, let me, I'm in a bigger screen. The motion to approve is incorrect. The date says October. I'm trying to get back to my to the agenda.
I see what she's saying under the public, under the public content. It says motion to approve minutes October 3rd, 2023. We can get that changed in board docs.
Oh, okay. I see. Yeah, public comment. That's the content.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Collin. I think, and then the second is 2A recommended action for item 2A is incorrect as well.
All right. What needs to be changed under that one?
I'm trying to get back to my agenda.
Under the public content, it's got the wrong date again.
Okay, thank you.
Unfortunately, whenever we copy templates, this happens and we missed it. I apologize.
So we will be looking at adopting the agenda with 2 corrections, one for 1C, the second one for 2A. Do we have any objections to that?
And Ms. Kellen, I'm sorry. I thought that we were and I think I heard you say this, but the constituent board pay was on our previous agenda for today.
I tried to follow up with Mr. Calhoun because I didn't have any information on it and I never heard back from him. So I made a judgment call and I removed it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. That's it for me.
What we can do, we can talk about constituent boards under 5B when we look at the FY25 budget update. All right, so we are looking at adopting agenda with changes to 1C as well as 2A. We have a motion first.
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
No opposes. The agenda has been adopted with those changes to be reflected. We will now move on to 1C, the approval of minutes for February 6, 2024, keeping in mind the change that was just made on the date under public comment.
Move to approve.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and second. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye as well. The ayes have it. We will now move forward to 2A, which will be Craven.
Yes, good afternoon. So for the contracts above 250,000, we have 22 total submissions for a total of 19,797,000. I did want to point out to item number 2. So item number 2, we have a total of 559,000, and we have FY24 FCO dedicated for that. It was brought to my attention this morning that that total amount is correct, but that funding is split. And so I'll make that correction for the Board of Trustees meeting. The numbers for FY24 from that contract will be $331,209.10. And for FY25 FCO, it will be $227,879.10. And that's the only correction for today.
Okay.
And with that, I'll open up for questions.
Thank you. Let's start online. Ms. Robertson.
Okay, I think when the camera turned, I saw Mr. Prentice in the room, the new CFO.
Yep, he's here.
Okay, Mr. Prentice, I'm not sure if you've already started the onboarding process or not, and if Ms. Collin has had an opportunity to speak with you regarding my concern with this report. So I will allow you an opportunity to say yes or no. If you are Ms. Carlin, have you had an opportunity to speak with him regarding my concerns with this report?
No, ma'am, we have not. My official start date is next Monday, March 18th. So Ms. Carlin will have a few days of crossover before she departs the organization. So I'll talk to her about that. Okay. So let me just give you a little background. Ms. Carlin can go into details when you on board with her next week. I'm really concerned. I believe this report came out of a disparity study and a risk management study that happened. And it was supposed to, from my understanding and my research, give the board oversight of the contracts that comes through procurement. When I came on board as a trustee, my concern was I'm not sure what we were supposed to do with this report. And what I mean is that the dollar value has already been approved in the budget. So we know that the money is fine. And so it must be the procurement process that was the issue. So my concern is when we look at the procurement justification and solicitation number, obviously we are supposed to know that as far as an oversight function of the board, that this process and this justification is correct. I'm not sure that this is giving us all the information that we need to know to make an informed decision. What is the standard process? How many days a bid is supposed to be out? When I look at this report, some bids are 8 days, some's 10, some's 18. Is it a standard process for 30 days? It's just a lot of things in this report that it concerns me, that it's not an efficient way to approve contracts. Is it that, the procurement department is telling us that the procurement officer and the contract officer has approved everything and they know that everything on this list is good, and they're bringing it to the board saying that the procurement justification is solid, and all we're doing is saying, everything is, they're telling us that they went through everything and it's okay for us to approve? Because I'm not getting anything when I see different information. Another thing that's concerning to me is the change orders. When I first came on this board, Malden and Jenkins did an audit, and one of the things that was a finding was change orders. On this particular report, there are numerous change orders. What's the reason behind all the change orders? One of the findings said that it was too many change orders, but yet nothing has decreased. We still have the same amount of change orders. Let's look at item number, and I'll just pick this out, nothing with Lisa Allison, but I'll just use number 3 as an example. It says fund source, multiple funds. What does that mean? Is the funding for this particular line item is coming from GOF Title I ESSER. What does that mean? For me to say okay to this, I don't know, what does that mean? Continuing universal contract. So these are things for me as a member of this committee, and as a member sending this forward to the board and my colleagues, I would think that we would need a little bit more information for the layman's on this board to understand exactly what is it that we're approving. So these are some concerns that I have with this style of reporting and the reason that this came up through the disparity study in the risk management.
Ms. Roberson, this is Anita. Thank you so much for sharing those with Mr. Prentice. We will work together collaboratively as we onboard Mr. Prentice with Mr. Craven, who's also, we're fortunate to have him as part of our family, and maybe some members here on this team to go back and study the intent of this board action and look back at the study you referenced, and we'll come together as a team to address your concerns. So thanks for sharing those.
Thank you. Is there a timeline that we could have this done? Because we've had some issues before where information from capital projects where we had questions and it wasn't the capital projects problem, it was how it was reported. So this is just not my first time saying it. And so I think for me, I would like to know how long is it going to take for us to get this rectified?
Right now, Mrs. Roberson, Mr. Prentice won't be officially onboarded until next week. We have spring break and the holiday in between. We will do our best to meet within the next month and talk to the Audit and Finance Committee about this, if possible, at the April meeting, but it could be a challenge. So it may be May before we get back to you, but know that we will do a thorough job, again, investigating the original edition of this, the intent of it, and speak to some financial members of the team here, along with our internal experts, to make a solid recommendation for next steps.
Thank you.
All right. Moving on to Mr. Grabowski. Do we have him on? Not hearing Mr. Duke.
No, I have no questions.
Ms. Stamp. So, all right.
No questions.
All right. Thank you. I can't see who's all on the participants list. So, all right, and I have no questions.
This is Michael Hallis. I have no questions.
Oh, there you go. I see you over there, Michael. Thank you. All right, perfect. So no questions. We're gonna go ahead and move forward to 2B. 2023-2028 capital programs. Mr. Hamer.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Calhoun, members of the committee. Back in January, the board approved a reallocation of funds from our capital programs to be added to the program contingency. We reprogrammed or reallocated $4.5 million towards the contingency. In discussions with Mr. Roy, along with my planning staff, I recommended taking that $4.5 million and reallocating it to some other requirements within the capital maintenance program. As you see here, I want to distribute that among Baptist Hill Athletics at the price of $2 million, or the funds of $2 million, and distribute also the balance of that of $2.5 million with some emergent requirements at Goodwin. When we did the reallocation of the funds in January, it was based on some decisions that were made for the future of Goodwin relative to Lambs and Hunley Park. And that necessitated adding some more to the program there. And so the distribution of the $4.5 million be among those two schools with those three programs.
Thank you. We'll start with Ms. Roberson.
Thank you. I have no questions. Very clear report. Thank you.
Ms. Stamp. Mr. Duke.
No questions.
Michael.
No questions.
No questions.
I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Hamer.
Thank you, sir.
We're gonna move forward to item 2C, Head Start and Early Head Start FY 24 financial report with Ms. Foxworth.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Calhoun, Vice Chair Dunmeyer, and Audit and Finance Committee. As a reminder, I'm here to present our regular responsibility of the Board of Trustees to review our financial records as part of being the governing body of the Head Start grant. I'm here to present the financial statement and the credit card expenditures from November 2023 through January 2024. You have the information in front of you. Just note the variances in fringe benefits and other purchase services are caused by additional revenue that was solely created by the vacancies that we continue to have. In April, we will be coming forward to you with an amendment. The Office of Head Start requires us to do an amendment of anything over $250,000. So that will come in front of you in April. But we are still having a high number of vacancies that we are filling through subs. So that's the end of my report. If you have any questions.
Same order, Ms. Roberson.
Okay, 1 second. Let me get back to the report. Is Miss Avis in the room?
She's right next to me.
Okay, Ms. Rock, I see the P card expenditure report, and for me, just looking at it, it's just, you know, a lot of transactions. I am going to assume that, and with your expertise, that you have went through this list and rectified everything, and all is well with this list of transactions.
All is well.
Thank you. I have no questions.
Right. Thank you. I saw that Ms. Stamp is having issues with her sound, so we're gonna move on to Mr. Duke.
No questions.
Michael.
No questions.
No questions.
I have no questions. We will move forward. Thank you, Ms. Foxworth.
Thank you.
Excuse me. All right, my favorite part, public comments. I know we have one written, one submitted comment for that was online. We'll get those passed through to the committee. And how many do we have in person? All right, we got 2 in person. Let's go to 3 minutes. All right, the first one, Ms. Dorothy Jenkins.
Good afternoon.
Good day.
As a retired teacher, as president of the NAACP Charleston branch, as a resident of this community, I just wanted to voice my concern as you go over the budget, that we would take into consideration investing in our teachers and making sure that we get the best for what we have to offer. If we want them to promote best practices, we have to be responsible as stewards to make sure that we do what's necessary, to make sure that we offer incentives for our teachers so that they can move forward in a positive way. When I was in the classroom, there's no way to give them all the money that they do deserve because of their due diligence. You make home visits, phone calls, grading papers, in addition to being on that computer so that you can have IEPs as a special ed teacher that I had to go through. And I want us to also consider all other staff members. I would be in that building late at night working on those IEPs, making sure that everything was correct. And then the custodial staff had to come in after I was ready to leave. So we have to consider the cafeteria worker, all of those persons who are employed by Charleston County Schools, to make sure that they're not having to spend additional time on another job in order to do what's necessary to keep their finances flowing. Insurance is going up, the cost of living goes up, housing is expensive, particularly on the peninsula, traveling back and forth. All of these things need to be taken into consideration when we think of those persons who are giving the best to our children. We want them to mold their minds so that we'll have an opportunity for them to strive in the future. So I ask you to take that into consideration as you prepare and deliberate over the budget.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate you coming. All right, next up, David Benezi. Please tell me if I pronounce your last name correctly.
Yeah, thank you, and very few people do. Thank you for all of you for your service to our community and our children. My name is Dave Benezi. I'm the teacher at Carolina Park. I'm the 2004 Teacher of the Year. I do not envy you guys and the Herculean task that you have in front of you balancing our budget, especially in light of the looming ESSER cliff. However, I want you to keep this question in mind during this budget cycle. How can we have the best and brightest future generation without the best and brightest teachers in our classrooms? We cannot. Last year, the efforts of our district to raise the steps out to 40 years, raised $5,000 in the salary schedule across all cells, excuse me. And a $5,000 bonus was a huge win for teacher recruitment and retention. With these actions, we drastically reduced vacancies in our district. However, we cannot rest on these actions alone. There's more work to be done. At the very least, we need to ensure that that $5,000 bonus is permanently cemented into the salary schedule this year. If we fail to do that, then it's going to be perceived as a pay cut. Teachers will make less money next year, and we're going to lose the momentum that we gained last year with recruitment and retention. And it will also serve as a huge blow to teacher morale. Please ensure that we cement this bonus into the salary schedule permanently, and we need to continue to send the message to our teachers that we are committed to raising salaries to a living wage so that we can continue to retain and recruit the best and brightest for our kids and our future generation in our community. Thank you. I appreciate you.
Thank you. We appreciate you coming out. All right. Like I said, we had one written, one emailed comment that will get distributed throughout the board, throughout the committee as well. Do we have the topic of it? Walk twice. All right, it is a written comment looking at teacher salary increase as well. So just keep that for the record and we get this distributed throughout the committee. All right, we're gonna move on to 4A, B, and 4A, B, and C, the action items that were just presented. The first one being the purchases and contracts greater than $250,000. Do we have a motion to approve the $250,000 greater contract list?
So moved.
We have
Second.
We have was that Mr. Grabowski? Am I hearing
It
him?
was Steven.
I'm going to abstain.
Oh,
I wasn't
okay.
here.
Stephen, you abstain?
No, I put the second.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry.
Who was doing the abstaining?
I'm going to abstain from this, Mr. Cal,
Okay, perfect.
And I vote no.
All
on
right.
these votes.
So on 2A, we have one no,
2 noes.
2 no's. Mr. Grabowski abstain. Mr. Duke,
Yes.
Mr. Hallis?
Aye. Yes, you got it right.
Yes. And I will go yes. The ayes have it. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 yeses with 4 ayes, 2 nays, and 1 abstention. Abstention. The ayes have it. Moving on to 4B, the 2023-2028 capital program phase 5. Do we have a motion to approve the reallocation of funds as shown?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
I'll abstain. Mr. Collins, Keith Grabowski, I'll abstain.
Thank you. Any nays? We have 6 yea, 1 abstention. The ayes have it. Moving on to 4C, the Early Head Start financial report. Do we have a motion to approve it as written?
So move.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
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 Aye. The ayes have it. Any nays?
I'll abstain, Mr. Collins.
Thank you. We have 6 yea, 1 abstention. Now we will move on to, the ayes have it. Thank you. Moving on to 5A, the monthly capital projects report. That will be given by Ms. Costello.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Calhoun and Vice Chair Ms. Roberson, Superintendent Huggins, and committee. I'd like to present the January 2024 Capital Projects Report. The revenue collections for the 2023 through 2028 Sales Tax Capital Program were $959,000 above our cash flow projection based on the most recent collections with a 2% growth over the prior year. This was our 12th month of collection for 2024, and at year end of December, we are up $403,000. So we had a few down months, but we ended on a positive note there, and I wanted to share that. The expenditures for the 2010 through 2016 program were $11,000. The 2017 through 2022 program, $2.8 million. The 2023 through 2028 program, $6.2 million. The 2023 through 2028 long-term debt program was $130,000. Our fixed cost of ownership programs are wrapping up. Fiscal year 23 is in the final stages. Fiscal year 24 is in the final stages of our spending schedule in May. And the fixed cost of ownership 2025 program has commenced. It was board approved last night, and everyone is hitting the program right now. So we're off to a really good start. I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, we go in the same order. Ms. Roberson.
Thank you, Ms. Costello, for your report. And let me just go on record by saying that I read your report in its entirety, and thank you for the details of your reports.
Welcome.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Grabowski.
Ms. Costello, I would ask if you could possibly add in your revenue reports, because it seems like you do real well in reporting the drawdowns on the various things. But at the very beginning, you do start off with a revenue, discussion. And it really helps because I love your reports too, but on the revenue side of it, I sometimes get confused when you say, we're 950,000 and then suddenly it goes down to 403. And, it kind of goes like, well, which is it? So if you could just add in that paragraph explaining the revenues, it would be just so much simpler considering everything else that we look at.
I can certainly do that. The revenues I'm projecting for the December of the increase of 949,000. I don't have that information typically when the reports are due, so that's why I share the latest and greatest at this meeting. And the 403,000 in a positive direction, that was the accumulation for the sales tax collections in calendar year 2024. Does that help answer your question?
So Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. It's hard attending by Zoom. I don't mean to cut you off. So the 403 was the total sales tax over, I mean, that's what we exceeded
Correct.
over our projections.
Correct. For the first calendar year.
Right. And so what we're looking at right now, based upon the latest and greatest, is 949 over and above what you've projected for on this balance, on this budgeted year.
Actually, that was for the month of December. The 959 was above the projection for December. The 403,000 was above the accumulation of sales tax collected in calendar year 2024.
Got it. So in your next report, and I'm just trying to get so that, you know, as we go into this budget, you know, looking at the sales tax and hearing the drop in sales tax revenue on a monthly basis recently, I'm just trying to get a better feel for seeing how these trends are going, you know, and we'll be going for the next year. So.
Certainly, sir. And I can rework how I'm presenting this portion to make it clear for everyone. And I appreciate your feedback.
Yeah, I've been up in Columbia and today learning a lot about sales tax and revenues and some of our requests that we're making. So that's why it kind of hit me when I heard what you were saying, what I'm hearing, what the legislators are saying. I can just feel a little bit of trying to better understand this revenue projection for capital projects. But your reports are excellent, and I think if you just could do that, that would really help. Thank you very much. That's it.
Welcome. And just to clarify, our projections are based on the oversight of our financial advisors and monitoring the trends we've had for the 2 previous programs.
Great.
We're in close contact with them weekly to make sure we're presenting the latest and greatest.
It's always impressive to see that you're above your projections.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, Ms. Costello, I agree. Your reports are high level, but it's detailed and it gives us everything we need. So I don't know if, you know, there's a level below that, but it does give us everything that we need.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. We're going to move on to Ms. Stamp. Mr. Duke.
No additional comments.
Oh, thank you. There you go. Mr. Duke.
No comments.
Michael.
No comments.
No comments.
And I have no comments. Thank you again. I really appreciate it. All right, we're going to move forward to the ESSER update. To Ms. Carlin.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. So actual expenditures to date through January 31st, 2024 for ESSER 3 funding is $121.8 million. We currently have $18.5 million encumbered, and majority of that is payroll, salaries, and benefits. So remaining to date is approximately $22.9 million. Also included in this report is a breakdown of expenditures by object, where you can clearly see that what most of the money being spent right now is included in salaries and benefits. We're still scheduled to make the second half of the ESSER bonus in March. So you'll see more expenditures coming in between the months of February as well as March.
Thank you. Let's go in the same order, Ms. Roberson.
I don't have any questions regarding those 2 reports, Ms. Carlin. There's a link that you included for the ESSER 3 non-salary expenditures.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, and so this is, well, never mind. I have no questions.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
All right, Mr. Grabowski.
Yeah, I have a question in the notes when we get to the 2024 revenue and expenditure report. There was in note 3B, Purchase services are projected to be 2.7 over budget. This is due to SPED substitute services needed to support schools due to vacant position. This also includes multiple invoices originally budgeted in EdSur 3 plan that had not to be paid from the general fund when the SDE denied multiple federal non-compete procurement requests. I mean, it's the first time I've seen something like that, and I'm just wondering how that affects this report on, any potential, because it looks like right now reimbursed to date and actual expenditures were pretty good.
Yes, sir. That is an accurate statement.
But on the other hand, it does see that we've had, and I don't know if this was just, we moved it from one fund to the next funding source, but I'm a little concerned when I see something that says denied due to non-compete procurement request. And, is this something that was happening in the past and that we've corrected and then we don't anticipate to see that again? And how does that affect this report?
So there's a lot of questions that you just asked. So first off, there were several, if you recall, and Jeffrey, I may need your help with the actual dates, but we received notification from the State Department that there were several items in ESSER 3 that we were trying to purchase with federal funds that were over $10,000 that needed the non-compete procurement agreement with vendors. And unfortunately, because we had already committed those funds with vendors, we were in a position where even though we went ahead and applied for the non-procurement, it was denied by the State Department. And so I had recommended to Superintendent Huggins that we move forward with those expenditures, but that we pay them out of general operating fund instead of ESSER funds, so that we didn't get ourselves in a federal funding non-compliance issue. So that's what that is under purchase services for the January financial update. I was just being very, very transparent and trying to explain why we are going to come in over on purchase services for the fiscal year.
And maybe I'm trying to understand, when you say over, you mean, in other words, more than what we budgeted?
Yes, sir. That is
on the GOF. Okay, I've got
yes, sir.
So have we done, I'm assuming with this one instance, we went back and looked at everything to make sure that we were in compliance so it wouldn't happen again.
Exactly.
And I'm just thinking for the next 3 or 4 months going forward. Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
What else do I want to ask you about? No, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Duke?
No questions.
All right, Ms. Stamp?
She answered when she answered Mr. Jaboski's questions. Some of the areas I was looking at. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael?
No questions.
No comments.
Thank you. And I must say, this is Ms. Carlin's final meeting with us. Thank you for everything you've done over the last few years and actually throughout your time with the district. And we really do appreciate you. And don't go too far. We here. You know where we at. So
thank you,
we'll
sir.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Again.
Appreciate that.
All right. We will now move forward to the monthly financial report.
Okay. Thank you, sir, again.
Not too far, right?
So through the end of January 2024, things are looking really good. You'll notice that we're showing a dramatic increase in actual revenues versus what we budgeted by about $26 million. Most of that is due to the most recent tax assessments that we received from the Charleston County Auditor's Office. Unfortunately, this has happened to us, time and time again, and Mr. Prentice and I are looking at a different way of doing, of handling the budget with revenues moving forward. On the expenditure side, we are still projected to come in under budget by about $7.6 million. And so at this point, even though we budgeted to use $14.4 million of fund balance, we are not going to need that. And we may actually be able to increase fund balance by an additional $19 million.
All right, Ms. Roberson.
I have no questions.
Mr. Gorowski.
Yeah, and I go back to the expenditures, 7.6 under, yet almost 13 million of it is allocated to unfulfilled school vacancies. So that would show to me that our expenditures actually are about 5 million over and above what we projected. Am I reading that right?
Yes, sir. When you take the vacancies out of the equation, that is an accurate statement.
Which is still pretty amazing considering the size of this budget, Ms. Carlin. So I am definitely going to miss you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I think that's all. Oh, I know you had a weighted increase of 16% for the Meeting Street schools. Could you explain that?
Yeah.
It was in note.
Well, it wasn't just, it was all of our charter schools.
Oh, okay.
And it was something that we did not know about when we actually budgeted for the charter school payments for the fiscal year 24 budget. And by the time we realized it, our budget was already in place and we were already well into the fiscal year. We've notified the charter schools about this as well. And we just wanted to be transparent to show why we're going to possibly have a $3 million item over budget for this line item.
So is it just a change in the formula? Or
Well,
the numbers?
It's a lot of different things. If you recall, charter school revenues are based upon our revenues. So of course, when we finish the year better off than we planned, that is good for charter schools. They get a portion of that. But also on the other side of that is the weighted pupil units that number is given to us by the State Department of Education. And so that number increased dramatically and we didn't see that coming. And so that also played a factor into why these charter school payments were much higher than what we budgeted for.
Okay, so it wasn't just because they had more students. It was just as to the way the formulas are set up.
Well, that
as
also,
to like the revenue sharing.
So some charter schools did see an increase in enrollment. So that also played a factor into it as well.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Stamp.
No questions.
Mr. Duke.
No questions.
Michael.
No questions.
Kudos, no questions.
And I have no questions myself. Let's get down to the FY25 budget update. This is what we're here for. Who's starting it off? Ms. Huggins.
I'm happy to turn it over to Mrs. Carlin and Mr. Prentice to overview for audit and finance where we currently are as a district in regards to FY25 planning. Then we'll talk to audit and finance about our thoughts regarding how we best support students in the coming year. And then Mr. Prentice and Ms. Carlin will wrap it up by explaining what we believe to be our next steps and opportunities for funding and balancing the budget. So Mr. Prentice, Ms. Carlin, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, good afternoon. So what you're going to see this afternoon is exactly what we presented at the board workshop earlier this week. And go into a quick agenda here. If you can go to the next slide. We're going to look at the current year performance with respect to revenues and expenditures, and that's going to mirror the financial report for the ending of the month of January that Ms. Carlin just presented. Look at some updates to revenue projections, talk briefly about the budget philosophy, and look at some considerations for funding to be able to balance the FY 2025 budget, as well as next steps after we talk about some of the programming that's being considered. So if you go to the next slide, looking at current year performance, this mirrors what was just presented, FY 2024 budget as approved by the board of $702.3 million. And looking at projections as of the end of January, we're looking to come in at $728.4 million, which is a $26 million variance, equivalent to 3.71%. Majority of that is in local sources, and we're going to continue to refine that as we look at the assessment data coming in from the county auditor's office and actual revenue postings from the treasurer's turnover over the next couple of months to try to fine tune that as part of our FY25 projections, which leads me into the next slide. Are we there? Okay. So the FY24 projection compared to our FY25 estimate reflects a $27.3 million increase over the FY24 year-end revenues, which is 3.75% over. And again, majority of that is in local sources, 22.9 million. Right now, we've reflected $9.3 million in state sources. And as the state goes through their budget process and we are able to get more information about what that's going to look like, we'll refine those numbers and hopefully see some additional support in that category. We talked briefly previously at the budget workshop about the delta in the transfers, and that is related to the indirect cost allocation, I think related to some of the federal programs and the actuals associated with that as we went through the year. But of course, those numbers are estimates as of March 10th, and we'll refine those as we go further through the process. So just to wrap all that up on the next slide, comparing to FY24 base budget, we're looking at $755.7 million in fiscal 25 at this point in time, which is $53.4 million in revenue over the FY24 approved budget, or 7.6%. So that's really where we are at this point in time in terms of considering resources to balance for the upcoming fiscal year. If you go to the next slide real quick. So that's the revenue growth primarily in local sources at this point in time. We'll refine that as we get later into the month of March and into the April Audit and Finance Committee meeting. I guess we'll meet one more time before we go to another board workshop. So we'll have some more information to share with you first before we go into that board workshop. And then again, looking at state revenues further. Next slide. So shared with the board, just the overall philosophy for the budget process in terms of how we're going to approach balancing. And of course, the first and foremost goal is to let growth in the assessment base pay for growth in the system in terms of expenditures. And so using the current millage levy, what does that generate? We want to fine tune those numbers and make sure that our projections are as accurate and clean as possible to be able to balance the budget. And then we've looked at opportunities and we're talking with our financial advisors to look at reallocating amongst levies, since we do have a debt levy and an operating levy that's approved. And the debt levy, as those revenues grow and the debt service schedules, we know those numbers over a long term in terms of what we're expected to pay based on principal and interest on bonds that are outstanding. We may have an opportunity to reallocate some of that millage to the other fund to be able to keep millage levy static, but to provide additional operating revenue. Looking at the fund balance policy, and of course, knowing that at this point in time, we may increase our fund balance by $19 million at the end of the fiscal year. If there's an opportunity to sustainably appropriate fund balance for certain expenditures and tie that fund balance to those expenditures for ongoing programming, we will certainly consider that in compliance with the fund balance policy. But above all else, those options before we contemplate any millage increase and hoping to be able to keep the millage levy static. So as we go through the next slides, we have various scenarios for the committee to consider to understand the priorities of the board. That will help us balance the budget, knowing what those variables are. These scenarios include low ends, mid ranges, and high ends of various different options. And they're meant to be taken as part of a whole in the sense that, for example, teacher pay, you have 3 different options that are being presented, and each of those options has a significantly different price tag. And we want to be able to roll those priorities into a long-term forecast as we refine the budget process. And then after we go through that, we'll talk about some balancing tactics. So I will turn it over to Ms. Huggins, I believe.
Thank you for that, Mr. Prentice. I want to make sure that the audit and finance team, I know you're focused more on the finances, but it's important to us for you to understand that our expenditures around this year's budget are clearly aligned with our board's goals and guardrails in regards to improving student outcomes. And so we won't go through each block here, but as we go through the subsequent slides, you'll see pieces of these things come up. It's really important to me and to the cabinet and to chief level officers that we vertically align the work and that the budget office is in sync with the academic side of the house. So next slide, Stephen. I'll review with the audit and finance team again, the 5 strategic budget actions that the cabinet and I outlined around the FY25 budget. One, and the first and foremost really being to sustain academic gains of our students. We think you'll see that today through a weighted student-based funding model that we are recommending to the Board of Trustees for approval. This has been vetted through a group of principals and district leaders who have been in several meetings about this with an external consultant, a former superintendent from Charlotte-Mecklenburg, where this model was implemented. We'll talk a little bit more about it later. Staff is also recommending to the Board of Trustees a teacher pay increase along with a non-teacher pay increase and a review that Mr. Brigman's in the midst of now of school-based non-teacher position upgrade potential there. Mr. Brigman can quickly review that in just a bit. Number 2, so again, first and foremost, sustaining academic achievement of students is critical to our work here in CCSD. We've seen significant gains among all groups of students that are paramount and have not been evident in our history here in Charleston. So again, maintenance of that and growth from that are really both critical. 2, increasing support for all students. In our current allocation process, we're not able to necessarily do that equitably across the system. So again, that's going to be covered in our weighted student-based funding model that we'll review today, generally at a high level because your input is critical and we want to give you time for that. Expansion of AVID is a second curricular focus on which we'd like the board to consider approving. 3, expansion of child development and early learning programs. Mrs. Foxworth is here. We've discussed particularly around with our associate superintendents the importance of our not allowing a gap to ever grow in the early grades so that we're not trying to close the gap in middle and high school. So we believe item 3 here is critical to that. 4, we believe chronic absenteeism to be a key reason why students don't achieve. So we'd like to put some funding around our efforts to support students and families who are chronically absent. We also want to expand our summer intern program as we consider college and career readiness in our middle and high schools, as well as make mid-year adjustments to student enrollment. We have numerous schools across the district that have significant increases in pupils mid-year, overcrowded classrooms, not enough support to support those students. And so mid-year adjustments for enrollment, something that our principals have been asking for a very, very long time. So again, number 1, maintaining academic gains. Number 2, increasing support for all students across the system. Number 3, you've heard us talk a whole lot about ESSER as the Audit and Finance Committee over the last 2 to 3 years. We want to maintain what's good about ESSER, where we've benefited the most. We've analyzed our programs, we've assessed where we believe we've had the most success, and we have prepared a recommendation to the board, which would ask for about 12 to 13% of the $250 million that we received through ESSER. B, expand childcare for employees. We hear over and over on teacher surveys, on employee surveys, and from principals, the critical nature of being able to hire great teachers. And many times an impediment to that is the lack of affordable childcare for teachers in our community in particular. So C, the pipeline for leadership development is also critical as we look toward over the next couple of years, having more of our principals at retirement age and eligible for retirement. So again, sustaining academic achievement, supporting all students, and number 3, maintaining ESSER programs critical for this budget season. Number 4, with this comes increased school autonomy, increased school autonomy and increased transparency around how we assess what's going on in classrooms and in schools. So with the weighted student-based funding model, principals will have the autonomy to determine based on data what sort of supports they need in their schools, whether that be in FTEs, which are a full-time equivalent of people, or programs. So number 4 is increased student autonomy. And then I'm really excited about number 5. Mrs. Carlin and I had started discussing a 3-year financial plan aligned with the board goals, and Mr. Prentice has already started planning for that as well, as he's looked on a possible way to balance just the FY25 budget and thinking about the impact of millage and what we may be able to do in subsequent years. So those are our strategic budget actions. They're guiding our work. We believe we have a certain amount of required increases. Mr. Prentice, do you want to overview those really quickly?
Sure. So if you look at the available revenue of $53.4 million, we were trying to show to the board that, the required increases that need to be considered are fundable with the revenue increase that we're seeing thus far, and quantifying those things by category. Of course, the teacher step increases up to 40 years with benefits. And we talked to the board briefly, and I think Mr. Grabowski asked a good question. There's a mandatory component to the teacher step increases. And then of course, CCSD locally made the decision to increase those steps up to 40 years. So that cost is quantified at $5.1 million. Can't escape the health and dental increase through PIBA. That $2.2 million is based on what we understand to date in terms of their adjustments to the base rate as well as the modifier factor that they apply. There's $6.9 million associated with charter schools and Meeting Street Academy. Ms. Carlin touched on the basis for that a little bit earlier. We've quantified all the operations, contractual obligations, and other must-dos. Mr. Burrow spoke a little bit about that, $6.3 million. There's increases to various purchase services, nursing contracts, and other items throughout the operations realm. And then, of course, the $1.9 million increase to risk management for insurance premiums across all of our lines that are carried. Those are the figures that we have thus far that are rolled up into the budget. So a total of $22.7 million is categorized as required increases that we're including in the base budget at this point in time.
Thank you, Mr. Prentice. So for today's discussion and for our discussion with board members on Monday night, we put increases and considerations in buckets. And the first is represented by that required increases that, as you see there, a nearly $23 million price tag. Next, on slide 14, another consideration for our board. We value very much the work of our teachers in our classrooms, and know, as our teacher said earlier from Carolina Park, that without great teachers, our children simply will not be able to be successful. We talk a lot about curriculum and professional development and PLCs and all these things, but without great teachers, we don't have great outcomes. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Brigman very quickly to talk about the work he's done with the Teacher Compensation Task Force, who is recommending a $5,000 teacher salary increase in the FY25 budget. Mr. Brigman.
Sure. Thank you, Anita. So what you have before you here are 3 scenarios around teacher compensation. The first one, $5,000 across the schedule up to step 40. The second, $4,500, and then $2,500. The committee is recommending $5,000. The goal of the committee is to get to $58,000 in the next year or so, which mirrors what data we have around housing. I know Mrs. Huggins also talked about childcare being a huge issue for our teachers as well. We know as our more experienced teachers start to exit the system and we continue to try to recruit young people into the profession, we certainly know that our young teachers, as they enter the profession, are going to have childcare needs. So we really need to make sure we can address compensation for teachers. On the next slide, the non-teacher salary increase. So the scenarios we have here, and I know many of you in audit and finance have heard the conversations about market and the study that we had conducted by Gallagher back in 2014. But the information here is showing maintaining the 97% of market, which is a 3% cost of living with benefits for a little over $6 million. Then the idea of trying to move forward to get closer to 100%. So the next scenario is 98% of market and then 99% of market. You can see the 98 is a little over 8 million. 99 is a little bit over 10 million or 10 and a half. Of course, we have non-teacher steps, which is 2.6. And last year we took teachers, actually a year ago, this time we went from step 30 to step 40 for teachers. We would like to start mirroring that for our non-teachers. So the board made a decision for July 1 of 2023 to add a step to non-teachers. They were at step 30, so now they're step 31. We recommend going to step 33, but we've shown the cost of 32 and 33. And then we have our study going on to evaluate the school-based hourly employees that are, again, school-based.
So we'll stop there for just a moment because slide 16 is midway through this presentation. We've already said a whole lot just about required increases, salary considerations for teachers and non-teachers. Again, our teachers are best supported by non-teachers and classified and administrative staff who work also very closely with our teachers, teacher assistants, for example, front office staff, clerks, et cetera. We very much believe that they too need a pay increase. So we'll pause there in case there are any questions from audit and finance members around required increases, anything Mr. Prentice presented to date, or any questions around the teacher compensation task force and the considerations for non-teacher salary increases before we move on to the weighted student formula.
Thank you. Yes, I was just about to say the weighted student formula is coming up next, but let's start with Ms. Roberson.
No, I don't have any questions. My question is about the WSF.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Grabowski.
Computer. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I guess the toughest thing to do with the way this is presented, with all the different options, unfortunately, is it's almost like you need to create a model, doing the best case scenario, which would be 9 non-teachers would get 99%. And, we would be giving our teachers a 5,000, and then do another model that shows, the baseline expense of what, non-teachers at 97 and the teachers at 2,500, only because we can look at the projected costs, revenues, and we're looking at projected potential surpluses and adding to the reserve fund, because it's just you go 10 million here to 24 million there, and suddenly you're at 34 million, and then we know we've got the ESSER trying to recoup that on teachers. So I just struggle sometimes when I see all these different options without seeing how when you put the options together, what is the true effect on the bottom line? Does that make sense?
It does very much so, Mr. Grabowski. What we were hoping to do in Monday night's board meeting was to understand more, and we didn't have a lot of time to hear from trustees directly about their priorities. We can, and we don't still know in conversations with Mrs. Carlin and Mr. Prentice exactly about our revenues. So what we want to avoid is a scenario that we experienced last year where we build out multiple 20 plus scenarios. I don't believe in discussing with other superintendents that that's necessarily best practice. So we can certainly build out our recommendations as far as what we would recommend as educators and inside the system. And we can, at the same time, we'd like to get more information from trustees about their priorities. We were able to do that with the stickies somewhat, the sticky scenario. So what we'll be prepared to do when we come back to the April budget workshop is once we have more revenue, we can show a scenario, a best case scenario based on our recommendations, and then take some of the feedback that we got from you all on Monday to build out a few more.
Because I think we had this discussion last year. I know we've had it, throughout the fall, that the non-teacher salary increase consideration was by far, something that we had to address since we haven't addressed it. And, when you look at that amount compared to, what we would be giving the teachers in additional raises this year, they're pretty substantial when you put the two together. So when you've got the responsibility of coming up with a balanced budget, it's almost like you want to say, well, we've got to make that decision one way or the other. And, how can we do that and then have a balanced budget based upon what we know now? And I know you don't have the exact
Yes, sir.
projections,
Yes, sir.
but, I think that helps in eliminating the need to have multiple models is really try to get to the baseline of what can we really live with based upon what we're projecting.
I think you'll be pleased that we'll build out a few scenarios for you that incorporate various pieces of these considerations where we could, now that we have the line item on each of the options, we could change in and out so that the board can understand the implications of going with a 97% market versus a 99% market, or a $4,500 teacher salary increases versus a 5,000. So now that we have these in these buckets, I think it'll be easier for us to do what you suggested, which is to build out scenarios without having to exhaust our finance staff with 20 plus, again, based on the board and staff priorities. So we'll certainly be ready for that in April.
And it's almost like I want to say, go ahead. Let's see what would be the best case scenario for our staff, but potentially the worst case scenario for our budget.
Absolutely.
Would be to do a 99, so they understand this, because there is just such a misunderstanding as to the 3-year, 4-year, 5-year, 6-year impact of these increases. Taking into account the steps being increased to 32, being account the steps being increased to 40. I mean, nobody else in the state's doing that. So I really would love to see a scenario to where it's okay, fine, we're going to give you a $5,000 across the board, teacher raise. We've got this 40 steps that we've got to work within, and then we're going to go 99% on the non-salary increase considerations. And now show that to me and how it's going to impact our budget in the future, even though we don't know our revenue. Show me what that's going to be the impact, next year and in 3 years, so that people can really understand, how this, it's so easy to say, yeah, I'm going to give you $5,000 this year, and you don't take into account that $5,000 with the steps is 6, 7, 8, and the following year is 9, 10, 11. And I just, I listen to all of these discussions about salaries, and I just know they don't understand the ramifications of this, the long-term ramifications.
Thank you, Mr. Grabowski. Well, I'm excited that we have Mrs. Carlin and Mr. Prentice. I think you're going to be really pleased in April, because our discussions have been looking at a 3-year build out from what teacher salary increases would do and how that would impact the budget in multiple years. So I'm really, really excited that we have such a competent finance team, and that our discussions have all centered around how this impacts subsequent years. And we'll be sharing those things with the board when we come back together in April. And as we think about how to balance this budget and what balancing the budget would mean in subsequent years. I don't know, Mr. Brigman or Mr. Prentice, if you have anything you would like to add to that. I think they're good. So thank you, Mr. Grabowski.
Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. We'll move forward. Ms. Stamp.
Okay, my question is around the non-teacher salary increases. Was there any consideration given to having a minimum level of an increase? Because when you start talking about those employees that may be on the lower end of the pay scale, 3%, 4%, 5%, while the percentage may sound like you're really giving somebody an increase, when you apply that percentage to their base salary, you could be giving them less than $1,000 increase. Is that, so, and once, if they should get an increase in insurance, or that's negated. So was there any consideration around having a minimum that we would give a minimum increase of X dollars so that somebody really feels that they have gotten an increase?
So let me make sure I think I can answer your question. So was it 2 years ago, Jackie, that I think it was 2 years ago before this current board was our board. We rolled out a minimum starting salary for our entry level positions, which I believe moved from $12 an hour up to $17 an hour to be more competitive. So we bypass what I guess we would say was recommended in the salary structure from the consulting group and bump non-teachers up a certain number of steps. We also used to have a cap on non-teachers' work experience when they came to the district. They were capped at 12 years. So you could have a secretary bookkeeper that does the same job in Berkeley County as a secretary bookkeeper here in Charleston. But when they arrived, if they had 30 years, it was capped at 12. It took us 3 years to remove the cap, basically. So now there's not a cap. And then we're looking at extending the experience step that Mr. Grabowski just mentioned, the concerns about what that looks like multiple years out. So as far as all the salary structure for non-teachers is going up a certain percentage across the entire structure. So, I mean, you are still going to have those entry level positions depending on where they fall on the structure with their experience. And of course, will not see the same increase as someone that's further along on the schedule. I don't know if that helps.
I guess I'm just talking about a minimum. So say you have somebody that makes their annual salary is say $23,000. You apply a 3% COLA to that. So their increase for that year, it equates to less than $1,000 to like $690. Is that really, I mean, if we're trying to bring the staff salary up to reasonable levels, is that really, when you put that across the board, if they're getting paid biweekly or whatever, are they really seeing anything in their checks to say, I got a 3% increase? So all I'm saying is that as opposed to an increase of $690, that person would fall into a bucket that says at a minimum, their increase, even though it equates out to $690, nobody would get less than a $1,500 increase of a COLA. But it would go based on, once you work the numbers out, once that salary gets to the point where 3% is $1,500 or more, then the 3% kicks in. But if that 3% is less than that minimum, they would get that minimum. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay. So if the board wanted to consider something like that, I would not be in favor of adding the amount across the schedule. I could see that, like, if your entry level teacher or non-teacher receives $600 at the board, maybe made a decision that everybody got $1,500. And I would see that outside of the structure itself, because I don't want to lose the integrity of the structure. The other thing to also keep in mind, especially as we add steps, is in addition to, whether it is a 97% or 98 or 99% to market, there's also the value of a step, which is usually around 2%-ish, Jackie, 1.7%. So the person may see possibly a 6% increase or what have you, depending on where they are on the schedule.
I mean, this is talking about the COLA. It says
so
3% COLA. So when you're looking at, and I understand I understand having to balance the budget, I understand wanting to keep the integrity to your schedules. But also, I think we have to take into account and really show the employees that there's an interest there in ensuring that when they get a COLA or they get that it's something that they can see a difference in their checks. Because I can tell you at the lower end of these pay scales, you give somebody a 3 or 4% COLA, and they're not really seeing any difference in their pay, in their take home.
Okay. And just to clarify, the 3%, 4%, and 5% COLAs listed here are based on CPI. So it's about maintaining the salary structure. When we decided to bump the minimum entry-level salary to 17 an hour, a portion of that schedule is actually frozen on the front end because we're starting to impact the integrity of the schedule itself and how it's laid out. I mean, there are going to be new employees that come on board at entry-level type positions with no experience, who should not make more than someone, the way the structure is managed now, that has 30 years of experience.
And if the structure is if it's structured properly and correctly, that shouldn't happen. And so with the increases in the COLA, if you're giving somebody adequate increases with their COLAs, then you're ensuring that those employees with the experience, that their salary is staying within market. And so you don't have that situation where a new employee with no experience comes in making more than somebody that's been there 20 years. But that's just my.
Sure. I don't know of a scenario where we would have
I'm just throwing
coming in higher than an experienced employee, the way it's structured now. But
right.
I certainly can talk to the finance group about whether, and if it's something the board wants to entertain, a minimum increase for hourly employees. But I would not recommend it being part of the salary schedule.
Okay.
I don't know, Daniel.
I do think the board needs to consider that.
Yes, that's duly noted, and I would
thank you.
Definitely want to see that investigated at least so we can come up for April. Let's try to investigate it and try to push that through, just so we can present that to the board, particularly at this upcoming board meeting that we have. Thank you, Mr. Duke. I think I did you already.
I'm good.
Michael.
Good from my end.
So I've got just two quick things. I want to be efficient with the time. First, thank you for laying it out this way. I think it's very understandable and it helps put together the pieces and hopefully avoiding going through 40 different scenarios, because people can see the pieces and pick and choose and make decisions hopefully before rolling it into the model. My two questions. One, just so I understand, this is on slide 15 where we talk about the non-teacher salary increase. This isn't a large dollar, but I want to understand it. The 2.66 million, which is the non-teacher step and benefits, is that related to prior decisions that have already been made? Are we locked into that piece, or what? I missed what that piece is.
It may be something Jackie needs to respond to, but it is so the same as our teachers, Mr. Griffin, our teachers step. So if they're step 0, they go to step 1.
Right.
The structure is based on that employee that's at step 15 goes to step 16. So there's a cost to that.
But this is based on what we already have in place. There's no
right. This would be whether we do nothing up top.
So essentially, we're locked into this 2.66.
Yes, sir. I mean, the state in the past, especially for teachers, is giving us the flexibility to not step teachers. I'm sure the board could make a decision to not step non-teachers, but
But it
That
would
is
be
the way
kind of
our
going against our structure. It would be.
It would,
right.
we would not only lose the 97% of market.
Yeah, that's going backwards.
And we've
We don't
had
do
that happen before. We were, I think, one point for hourly employees at 93% of market at one point.
Okay, so I understand. So I understand what that is now.
Yeah.
Thank you. That helps. And my only other question is more general on our revenue projections, particularly out in 2025. Just interested, Jackie, or others, Anita, others, if you have any comments on your comfort and or confidence in those projections. And I don't mean that in any derogatory way towards, I just know that it's complicated. And I'm just curious what's your impression or experience with the variability of those projections from where we get them now to what we might realize?
So we feel very strong, confident with these projections because we just received updated numbers from the county auditor's office. And so we are basing those numbers on the actual billed assessments for tax year 2023. And that's the last set of numbers before they're executed delinquent over to delinquent tax office at the end of, treasurer's collectability. We do also know for fiscal 25 that these numbers are conservative. We want to do some analysis, what we were alluding to earlier, in new construction and assessable transfers of interest and all of those things that come into building the revenue picture for fiscal 25 that we don't yet have yet. And a lot of that will come from the assessor's office through their process going throughout the year. So we're going to try to get some of that data to build a better local revenue forecast for April and May. As if where we are right now is just very minimal growth on the actual auditor's office bill file from tax year 23. So we want to come up with a realistic file for tax year 24 based on some of those variables too.
So, and I don't want to add to the work that you already have, but as you do that process, I'd love to just have your commentary and perspective on what the range of variability might look like. And I don't mean it's false precision, I know, but give us a sense of whether you think that number could be plus or minus 10 million from what you're projecting, or plus or minus 5, or give us some sense when we get there, if you don't mind.
And certainly, and a lot of what I want to look at is actual, the numbers that we're going to be seeing, since everything's built in arrears, we kind of know what that environment looks like. So the discounts or the variability, if you will, would be more so in collection rates and some of those components based on historical trends, and then just trying to have an air of conservatism in there, in the event that, refunds and things that happen throughout the year based on properties going converted back and forth between assessment ratios happen. But we're going to kind of take that objective-based approach towards building it, and we can give some ranges.
Thank you. That's all I've got.
Thank you. Actually, just got to one of my questions about the conservatism of the revenues that we're looking at right now. We've been conservative a lot in the past with our numbers, and we a lot higher. So somewhere where we could have played in the past with the with raises or here or there or doing something else. Now we come back a year later and it's like, oh, well, we have all this extra money. Not on you, Ms. Carlin, that was on us, but we have all this extra money. So how do you feel as if as you're coming on, do you think that we're gonna move forward with trying to free up as much money on the front end so we won't have it so much on the back end?
Yeah, I think that going through that process that I just mentioned will help kind of tighten those numbers so that at year end, we're coming in very close to our projections. I mean, on a budget of this size, I would ideally like to be within 1% of, all revenue categories in the aggregate. And right now we're at about 3.7. So that tightening that I referenced could be, just the delta between the 3.7 and the 1%, and looking at all of those scenarios with, what's being billed. Of course, the complexity of Charleston County is all of these fee in lieu of tax agreements and the TIF districts and multi-county parks and all those things that happen throughout the year. And so those pieces have to be considered too. And so I need to wrap my head around all of that in Charleston County and kind of refresh on what those are, when those things expire, what new things are coming on board, just to make sure that, all those pieces and parts are considered. So any conservatism that is input in those numbers would be to account for areas that we don't quite have the answers yet with those. But I mean, if you look at, just looking at the assessment report from the auditor's office, I think our total assessment in the GOF is 3.3 billion roughly. Does that sound right? $3.3 billion. And fee in lieu of tax agreements are roughly $67 million of the total assessment. So it's not a huge percentage of the whole. It's just a matter of making sure that, that's accurate, because if you multiply the millage rate by that assessment, the dollar value that's associated with, needs to be categorically budgeted within fee in lieu of not current property taxes. And same thing with the TIF districts. I think TIF districts is roughly $28 million in assessment that's going to those tax increment financing districts at various jurisdictions throughout the county. And so at a certain point, when those districts expire, all of that revenue comes back to the district. And when new districts are created, that incremental growth in the assessment goes away from the school district, depending on the district's participation level, and just making sure that I've got a grasp on all of that as well to build that picture.
Cool. Thank you. The rest of my questions have to go towards WSF, so let's go ahead and move forward with that.
Sure, we'll go into Stephen to slide 16. What we're recommending, or
I
what?
had my hand up. I had my hand up. Could I say something?
Oh,
please?
hi, Dr. Temple.
Hi, hello from California. I just wanted to comment in this way. We made a lot of progress last year with our teacher salaries, and we need to remember that the most important person in our schools and in our district is the teacher. So I just wanted to bring it forward that, about our understanding, because I'm getting questions about this. So our base pay now is $48,000. And with the 5K that we would add to it, that would take us up to $53,000, which would be, if you think about it, that would be comparable to what we did last year with giving teachers a salary increase of 5 and then the bonus of 5. So I think we need to keep in mind that our salary is $48,000, and the $5,000 increase would just bring us up to what we determined last year we could do for teachers. And I agree that with the goal that we still need to work towards the $58,000. And also, I think we need to seriously consider what we can do for classified people, because last year we did nothing significant for them. So thank you very much for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Dr. Temple. We hope things are well there in California. We appreciate your focus on teachers and those who support them. So slide 16, we'll move forward to the recommendation.
Mr. Superintendent, I have one follow-up question. What is the percentage of new teachers?
Mr. Brigman.
Might have to pull that to make
Mr.
sure.
Grabowski, I'm not sure Mr. Brigman knows it right off the top of his
Well,
head.
let me ask a clarifying question. When you say, do you mean new teachers to Charleston County, regardless of years of experience, or new teachers to the profession?
Because I always love this discussion about starting salary.
Yes, sir. You're probably asking if I'm assuming where you're going next. You're probably asking how many first-year teachers we have who would start at a base salary in Charleston. Is that what you're asking? Versus
I would,
or new to Charleston.
Yeah, I would like to see. No, you're absolutely right, Ms. Huggins. I would love to see a chart showing the number of teachers at each step level.
Okay, I can.
Yes, sir. We can do that.
Because, there's always this assumption that we have this really large number of first year starting teachers.
Well, and the numbers is on the decline because of the number of young folks who are not going into the
Correct.
I mean, and 10% of our new teachers in the district right now are coming through our pathways programs.
Correct.
Or alternative routes. They're still first year teachers, but the traditional route, there's a major decline there. But I can certainly run a report of the number of teachers on each step, experience wise.
And it's interesting because I've had a lot of discussion with a couple of, I know at least 10 or 12 teachers that are in the pathway program over in my neighborhood. And it's interesting because, they're definitely people that have had, to qualify. This is their third or fourth career. And, I can see them doing this for about 5 to 6 years versus, a new teacher fresh out of school, which, when I look at the dismal job that colleges are doing in recruiting, teachers into their teaching programs. I mean, I think the nursing school programs are doing a much better job. And yet, when you look at the salary differences between a starting nurse and a teacher, it's amazing. The teachers actually get paid more. But yet we can get people into nursing schools. But I think it's important for when we go through these discussions that we definitely look at, because I remember at one time it was a U-shaped type of, it was an inverted curve where we had a smaller number of starting teachers, a large number in the middle range, and a large number, getting ready to retire. And I think we now have an inverted U where it's just the opposite. But I don't know. So I think that's really kind of a critical document to look, for future planning.
I'm happy
because, we always seem to focus on the starting salary. And I think the starting salary is to get somebody into the system. But at the same time, what we aren't taking into effect is that this goes across the board. And at the same time, we do have a lot of teachers that are coming in and that have worked for us for 4 or 5 years and are not making enough to be able to buy a house because of what happened over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yes, sir. And we talk about the starting salary because the change to that particular cell in the schedule impacts the entire schedule. And also when the recruiters are out on the road, all of the school districts that are at a recruitment event are comparing the starting salaries to all the other districts because that's what the recruits are looking at.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll put that together for you, Mr. Grabowski, and try to get it to you in this week's board brief, and Audit and Finance Committee members will also share that with you for your information. Thank you, Mr. Grabowski, and again, Dr. Temple. On slide 16, we want to overview a new way to allocate to schools based on student need. That is, we believe, the first of its kind here, certainly in the Low Country, but in the state. A team of principals came together with district staff. We've worked on this model since right before the holidays, and we're bringing it to the board for consideration and asking the board to make it a priority in this FY25 budget process. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions around it. I do want to make very clear that we don't have all the idiosyncrasies worked out with the process yet, but we met with principals yesterday who are very, very excited. We met with them again individually today, or started those meetings individually today to talk to them about after the board's interest in this on Monday. And then we're meeting with them again tomorrow. So there is a lot of excitement for the most part in our community around this. So we'll overview it now very quickly and ask you to certainly ask questions about it as we go. Feel free to stop me. So in this new model, we look to fund schools based on the needs of 3 specific student groups. We continue to allocate as we always have, but then on top of that, as we think about how to sustain academic gains, that first budget priority, and number 2, support all students, look at pupils in poverty, a group of students we know are challenged by a myriad of factors outside of their control. 2, multilingual learners, as you'll see in a subsequent slide, a growing population here in Charleston, particularly in North Charleston, the fastest growing populace of students that we have. And number 3, students with special needs. As we drill down to our data, we see that it is these 3 groups of students that continue to historically underperform compared to other groups of students. And so you'll see on slide 16 a ratio that we've proposed, again, in collaboration with external folks who have done this before, with financial experts, including Mr. Kennedy, Ms. Carlin, and others on their teams, and our principals to help make this recommendation. We believe in the elementary and Montessori schools, looking at a 3-to-1 ratio, the middle schools a 4-to-1 ratio, and the high schools a 6-to-1 ratio would help us do what we discussed earlier. Again, sustaining academic gains, supporting all students, and maintaining ESSER programs. This total is really about 35 million as we worked since Monday's workshop with the board to on some of the details around it. Now, what does that ratio mean, Anita? It means that for the purpose of allocating to schools, we would look at the numbers of pupils in poverty, the number of MLL students, and the number of special needs students in any school, divide by this number, 3, 4, or 6. So for every 3 students in an elementary student, or every 3 pupils in poverty in an elementary school, to the base student allocation, we'd add 1 student, and then we'd determine how many FTEs or positions that school gets based on that increased number. And we do that for each population. We divide 3 into the number of multilingual learners, 3 into the number of special needs students, and add those numbers to the collective whole. Does that mean, Anita, if you are a pupil in poverty who also speaks English as a second language, who also happens to have an IEP, that you would be counted 3 times? It does. Just as the state does so, this model would do so. It would allocate resources based on individual students' needs. If we go to slide 17, again, you'll see that it does just what we've suggested in those top 5 budget priorities. It hits all 5 of them when it looks at how we sustain gains of students, supports them, maintain those things through ESSER that we believe are most effective, and increasing school autonomy, letting principals and associates determine what they need based on student data. As I think I've shared with this group before, if you go on to slide 18, Stephen, you'll see here that these groups, we'll look at pupils in poverty only right now for the sake of time, but these groups impact across our system. Pupils in poverty don't just exist in certain areas of our county. They exist in Mount Pleasant, they exist in North Charleston, they exist on James and Johns Island, and they exist in West Ashley. In fact, if you look at this slide, you'll see that there are more pupils in poverty at West Ashley High School than St. John's has on its campus, by 3 nearly. So pupils in poverty impact this system holistically. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the data that I referenced earlier, the population increasing of multilingual learners across our system at the most rapid rate that we have. In fact, Pinehurst Elementary out in North Charleston is the largest elementary school in the state in regards to its multilingual population. And so that student group is growing exponentially out there. And the transient population, as far as students who come in and out, Mr. Pelagi met with us just yesterday and said over the course of a month, he could register 30 to 50 students, which is just astronomical if you think about that challenge. So we're guided by theory of action on slide 20, Stephen, that if we really believe that getting all students to read on grade level by 5th grade is key to ensuring that they're ready for math, they're ready for science, they're ready for social studies, and they're ready to leave our system, college and career ready, then this approach is very much needed to ensure that we're meeting the needs of all of our learners. The antiquated system that we're using is simply not enough anymore based on data and our whys to continue the progress we've seen with students. Number 2, if we believe that responsible resource allocation means first fortifying schools, and that WSF ratios that decrease school support will not do us any good, then we acknowledge that doing so during this unique time at the ESSER cliff is just simply not acceptable. And number 3, if we believe that mitigating the impact of the ESSER cliff is essential to sustain academic gains, and we do, then these ratios that provide schools with the means for sustainability from our perspective as a chief level team and as educators and as principals in Charleston County, we believe that this is really a non-negotiable as we think about the FY25 budget. So I know all of you fine folks on audit and finance love numbers, so we'll go to slide 21 and see how this breaks down across the system. So we've broken it down here by learning community, elementary, middle, and high, and Montessori, so that you see these ratios applied across the system. So divided by 6 in our high school community, the number of FTEs yielded for pupils in poverty is an added 50, MLL 17, students with disabilities 12, for a total increase in allocations of 79 at the high school, 65 at the middle school, 217 at the elementary school, acknowledging that, again, early learning is critical to student success, and 10 at the Montessori. Important for you to know, as we look at the next slide, Stephen, 22, is that when we talk about autonomy for principals, that means for us that we wouldn't necessarily have to add people, but it could be that Mr. Prentice and Mrs. Carlin work with, and they've demonstrated and acknowledged a willingness to do so. They work with principals who say, well, I don't want these 2 FTEs for people, I want them for programs. They work with us to acknowledge a set amount for FTEs and how that translates to a dollar amount so that principals would have the flexibility post-ESSER to utilize some of these resources, not for people, but instead for programs. So if you look on slide 22, you'll see another challenge that has plagued our system and how this breaks down in the actual numbers. So in our system, we have historically given overlays inequitably across the system to offer additional resources above those earned at the school level. And we believe, as we've looked at challenges back from 2014, 2015 regarding budgeting, we believe that some of those challenges could have been attributed to processes such as these, where we put a Band-Aid on a problem, a necessary Band-Aid, by allocating additional resources above and beyond what schools actually earn in the allocation process. For example, I gave this example to the Board of Trustees on Monday. On Johns Island High School, there are 350 students, give or take a few, and they simply don't earn enough FTEs to offer advanced courses. So Mr. Joyner historically loses students from Hawk Gap Middle School to, instead of going to St. John's, they go over to James Island Charter because James Island Charter has a bigger student population. It can offer more courses. So we've put a Band-Aid on that by saying, Mr. Joyner, build your advanced placement program, your dual credit program. Here are multiple FTEs for you to do just that too, for example. So captured in this first column here, audit and finance members, are the number of overlays at the elementary, middle, and high school that we have allocated in our system. It might be a 0.5 for a guidance counselor at Baptist Hill. It might be a 1.0 STEAM teacher at James Island Elementary, but we've represented that for you there, because we know we can't do all of this in the same year and still operate in the green or the plus or whatever you finance, the black. You folks call that black, okay? So we don't want to be in the red. The second column there represent the number of FTE requests through the ESSER program impact report process that we followed. So we added those 2 columns together, then looked at the total additional allocations from this new WSF model and backed out those numbers. So as we're meeting with principals right now, as I speak, principals are getting clarification on where their overlays exist, if they want to continue those overlays. And not shocking, we've had conversations with principals who said, hey, Anita, I don't want that overlay for that anymore. Now that I've got this flexibility, I want it for this. And we're talking about these ESSER impact requests and how they fared in that review process. So if we go on, you'll see here in a few slides that this process equals about $25 million. If we go on to the next slide, slide 23, we captured here that in addition to FTEs that schools have indicated they need or program requests that they've indicated they need, we've also looked at where we draw that cut line on that program impact report that I discussed with you last month. How do we determine that what we've done really works for kids? So we drew that line at about 70 for schools and 65 for central staff departments. And you'll see here that we have some programs within our approved range that will allow us to do other things outside of those FTEs. So on the next slide, Stephen, audit and finance members, you will see the total estimate for this program. And we think we're a bit off on this. We're still working on this. It's a work in progress. It's an approximate $30 million ask, which if, Stephen, you slide back up to slide number 20, you'll see is about 12% of the total ESSER funds that the district received. From our perspective, although some of those ESSER funds, and Mr. Brody and I have talked about this since Monday, not a significant portion of those were dedicated to operations, but most of our ESSER funds were dedicated to academics and to schools. So we believe that 12% of that to sustain what we've seen in student growth is minuscule compared to the benefits that we believe this will have on children. And so I know that's a lot in a very short period of time. I know it's really complex, but I'm happy to answer questions that you might have. And I'm thankful for you audit finance members being our thought partner in this to ensure we don't step in a lot of puddles along the way. So Mr. Calhoun, before we finish up the presentation, I'll turn it over to you for questions.
Ms. Roberson.
Okay, yeah, that was a lot, but thank you, Ms. Huggins, for that report. It all sounds really good, and given the categories that you've outlined, it does definitely, it will definitely help the schools in my district, I must say, because of those identified areas. I must say that my question, I have two questions. And I'm not sure if the expert that you referenced that you're working with is in the room. But I'll ask. I believe you mentioned Mr. Kennedy as one of the experts. And we all know that implementing and managing a new model can be difficult. But I think I would be remiss as a committee member if I don't ask, although you listed a lot of good things, for us as a committee to know if any of the experts that you worked with regarding this model and its implementation in Charleston, since it's a first, what are the cons?
So Mrs. Roberson, thanks for the question. The cons have to do with a lack of parameters around processes such as this. So our associate superintendents met with cabinet yesterday morning to ensure that we mitigate for the cons. The cons are allowing people to hire whomever they want to hire without any systems in place, allowing the transition of monies from FTEs to monetary gains that are used haphazardly, not on research-based programs that we know work for kids. So there are cons associated with not having systems in place for this work. And so we're learning from experts across the nation. We're looking at Boston's model really closely right now. We've looked at the Charlotte MEC and have modeled some of the work after what they've done in Charlotte, which, as you know, has 3 times the number of schools that we have. And this is the one program that seems to have maintained 4 different superintendents, as I shared with the board on Monday. So I think the cons are solely related in many instances to not having systems in place that measure the processes and ensure transparency and accountability. So I think what could also be a con is not measuring these things and allowing this to be a quote drain on the budget for subsequent years if we don't have data that suggests it works. So in talking to those across the country who've done this work and in working with those I consider financial experts locally in-house, we're trying to mitigate for what we anticipate could be cons.
Thank you for referencing data. Ms. Huggins, because that was going to be my follow-up questions. You referenced, over and over again about meeting with principals. And I think a big part of having this to be successful is the data collection and analysis and making sure that the data in the system is updated. So is Ms. Roberts or whoever, do they plan to meet with the data clerks to make sure that the school's data is up to date and clean, to make sure that, I know I'm getting in the weeds, but I think we have to make sure that, because that's the big part of this, your allocation is going to be based on the data collection and what's coded correctly in the system. And I think for me, that's going to be key. Do we have data clerks in all the schools to make sure that this process and this part is going to be, equal across the districts?
Thank you for that, Ms. Roberson. Interestingly, we had a question from Jackie Haynes earlier this week, and it was very, very similar to that. And Mrs. Roberts, who's here, I think responded to it already. Mrs. Roberts, would you come up and talk about, we do have data clerks in all of our schools and the work that Kathy Milne and her team do around that? Because you're right, Mrs. Roberson, clean quality data is key to lots of things in our system. Ms. Roberts?
Good afternoon. So our data specialists actually do work with Kathy Milne and her team with student information. The people accounting department actually provides that over-the-shoulder type training with those staff members. But we also have a lot of level data checks, which provide error reports so that schools can make sure that they've cleaned their data, that they have updated information. We also run verification reports and work with schools on that end as well. So yes, and I will say this too, allocations have always been based on, data being coded correctly in our student information system. That is a really important part of our system, a part of our funding reports for sure. So we do take that very seriously and we continue to improve those processes.
Thank you. And let me just say this, and I'll ask my final question. I thank Ms. Haynes for asking that question. I've not had conversations with her, but I'm sure to hear that someone had asked that, that's obviously something that's important. And I asked the question because I've worked in schools in Charleston where the data's not been clean. And so that's why I asked that, because if we're going to use a model that's going to be, allocations are going to be based on data, that's why it was important to for me. So I'm not sure why Ms. Haynes asked it, but I think that it's a very important question.
It's very, very important. You're right. Again, allocations, number of students, as you know, Mrs. Roberson, drives how many folks are in our school, what the 10-day, the 12-day, and we
absolutely
here to look at the 45th day or some sort of similar process that will allow us to make sure kids' needs are being served.
Yes. And my last question, Ms. Huggins, your ask is 30 million, and you said it could possibly be off maybe 35 million. And so how do we get there? My question is, and Mr. Grabowski and Mr. Calhoun, you may know the answer, but weren't we talking last year about setting aside 22 million for ESSER sustainability? So it's that money, sitting in a reserve account to.
I'm glad you asked, Ms. Roberson. I think we have about 32 and 30 is 32.
22.9. We put it
Is it 37? 37. So there's 37 million in ESSER sustainability, and I'm going to turn it over to, again, we've had some preliminary conversations, which are sort of more than preliminary at this point, about how you do this. How do we balance this? How do we figure out how to pay teachers? How do we allocate to schools? And how do we figure out how to compensate classified folks and still balance the budget? Because this is a whole lot of money. So we do have some ESSER sustainability. We are planning to make $8 million worth of cuts in central staff resourcing and positions. And we're working through that now, but I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Prentice and Ms. Carlin, who I think have some ideas around reassessment and all sorts of things.
Go ahead, Mr. Prentice.
Go for it.
So would you like me to go towards the end of the presentation and touch on some of those items?
So, you know what, Mr. Prentice, Mrs. Robertson, if it's okay with you, we'll defer that question to the end where Mr. Prentice will touch on
Okay.
the next steps there.
Okay.
Is that okay with you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, that's super. Thank you for the thoughtful questions.
Thank you, Mr. Grabowski.
Yeah, if you could just give me a second, because I want to go to his next steps before I ask my question.
Thank you, Mr. Grabowski.
Because as I look at this, just roughly, you know, we're depending on how we, you know, your ESSER requests on the state allocation. I'm assuming all we're doing at that point for that 25 million is reallocating the money we already anticipate we're going to get from the state. So the only real new money in the ESSER request would have been the 5 million. Because when I look at everything on the documents you've given us, if we went, you know, to give the teachers the $5 million raise, if we across the board, if we gave the classified up to 99%, the required $22 million, the 30 odd million, we're looking at $90 million over and above what last year's budget was. So I think on the next step, it's going to be really fascinating to see how we're going to be. I mean, I'm just taking rough looking at this $90 million. And yet we're only talking about cutting $8 million from the current situations on what we're spending money on.
So we'll go ahead, Mr. Grabowski. Well, I think Mr. Prentice is, I think he's looking and nodding and he's going to go ahead and respond.
Yeah, I really, I just,
Go ahead.
okay, thank you.
Prentice.
No, that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Grabowski.
Sure. And so I think this is kind of an answer to both of these questions. So on the ESSER sustainability piece, you know, the 36 or $37 million that's set aside, you know, we had looked at maybe doing that evenly over 3 years and $12 to $13 million a year. One thought that I have is possibly, you know, starting on the higher end and then stepping out of it, you know, from a sustainability standpoint, letting local revenues and growth take over, you know, from a sustainable standpoint. So front loading that use of fund balance in fiscal 25 and then decreasing the use of it in 26 and 27. But that fund balance is available and restricted for that purpose. So that offsets the $53 million in additional revenue and creates additional capacity in fiscal year 2025. The decrease or the cuts, the $8 million target is something that's being considered. So that would, you know, further grow that capacity. We talked about millage reallocation from debt to operating. And so, you know, 3 mills as an example could bring in as much as $10 million in the GOF. So very quickly, you look at 53 million becoming 63, 73, $83 million in available capacity in the fiscal 25 budget. And just wanting to make sure that all of those things, you know, from a multi-year standpoint, are sustainable in 26 and onward. And that's where we kind of get into the conversation about reassessment, knowing that in tax year 25, which is fiscal year 2026. So right now we're collecting tax year 23 and fiscal 24. So it always offsets by a year, but tax year 25 and fiscal year 26, we'll go through that countywide reassessment process. And so I want to make sure that we use that as an opportunity to stabilize the millage levy in the operating fund in particular, so that looking outward from that point into 27, 28 and onward, we know that we have a clear plan to fund all of these larger increases, such as the ESSER cliff and the large 5,000 potential dollar increases in teacher compensation from a multi-year standpoint, without just saying that we did it 1 year and then it coming back to haunt us in future years in a way that we weren't anticipating. So you're absolutely right, Mr. Grabowski. The number, if you add all of those scenarios together, you're certainly looking at, you know, potentially $90 million in additional cost over the fiscal 24 base budget. But all of those kind of multi-pronged approaches can, you know, come together, not to mention the fact that we are conservative right now in our revenue projections and refining those, and hopefully, fingers crossed, picking up some additional revenue from the state, which would go to, you know, kind of from a tying to expenditure standpoint, support those teacher increases depending on what they do with the scale and the lanes at the state level.
Thank you, Mr. Prince. Is that all, Mr. Grabowski?
Yes, I'm fine with that.
All right. Thank you. Let's move forward. Ms. Stamp.
So my concern, well, not concern, but I think what was outlined is very good. And I guess it is a concern that, and some of the conversations already been had, to try to put some controls in place so that the population that these numbers or additional allocations are being generated from benefit from those. So, and I do think there can be loopholes where those additional funds goes to the schools, and you want the autonomy for the principals. But again, there needs to be some control so that you really see the benefits to the population that's targeted. But the program, what's outlined sounds really good. If we have the proper controls in place to ensure the population that needs it receives the services.
Ms. Stamp, I'm so thankful for that feedback from you. I think it ties directly back into the question from Mrs. Roberson about cons, because you're spot on, and it's a chief concern, and all the feedback. We have various roundtable groups set up to give us feedback on this work. And when I met with the Interfaith Roundtable 2 weeks ago, this was what you just suggested was their chief level concern, that we would allocate additional resources and that they'd go to a new administrator or another special area or something that doesn't necessarily positively have a correlation to improved outcomes for MLL learners, pupils in poverty, and or special needs students. So I thank you for raising that, because again, I think that can be a con if again the systems and controls aren't in place. So thank you for that.
How did you determine, what was the basis for the calculating the pupils in poverty? What was the
Mrs. Carlin, do you want to respond to the pupil in poverty indicator?
No, yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. So what I meant to say,
Ms. Stamp, she meant to say yes to that.
What I meant to say was we looked at several different variations. We looked at 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 5-to-1, 6-to-1, even 7-to-1. I like my scenarios. And so Mr. Kennedy had recommended that we do all these different scenarios and just look at how it impacted each school by school. And so to answer your question, it was a cabinet decision on how we applied it towards Montessori, elementary, middle, and high.
And then Mrs. Stamp, the PIP, the PIP designation is a state designation. So we use that regardless of whether students receive free and reduced lunch. So that's how we made that final decision.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Stamp. Michael?
I think Ms. Stamp had voiced what was on my mind as well too, and then also the conversation around subsequent years as well too, and the potential effects on it and how we mitigate it. So nothing new to add.
Thank you, Mr. Duke.
Just reiterating what we've been talking about. And again, since I deal with data, constant data on a daily basis, understanding how important it is that the data is correct and that we're able to, allocate everything where it needs to go. I mean, the idea of allowing more control at the school level, I think works out a lot better, and it gives them more control over, what they think is best for their students and for their school.
Thank you for that.
So I have a couple quick questions. And if it's too complicated, I can take it offline so that I don't drag everybody in if necessary. But I'm just trying to understand the net change in the FTEs, the 198 additional FTEs. I'm on slide 22. So it's going from 173 to get to the target of 371. So that's the roughly 200 new FTEs allocated across the schools. Does that correspond to the $25.1 million? Is that?
Thank you for that, Mr. Griffin. I can always lean on your eye for detail. It does. That correlates to the 25 point whatever million
Okay.
on side 24.
Okay. So then then does that mean that I presume that whatever the cost is related to the current overlay, the 76 FTEs, that's already in our cost structure already, right?
Yeah.
That's already basically, that's already in, if you look at it, that's already in our current staffing and teacher models, right?
We did. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We've talked about this for a couple of days that now with while we're chuckling. So yes, sir, it is.
So then my question then becomes my last question on this is then what's left, the ESSER impact requests, the 97. Is that already in what we're spending, or where is that?
That's in the 25.
That's also in the 25? Or so the 25 is
is
then the sum of the 97 plus the 198 then?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's, Mr. Griffin, your question, why we think that 25, 144, should be more like 30.
Right. So when it seems then like it might be helpful for us to translate these FTEs into aggregate dollars
Yes.
when we come back, when we do this again, just so we can all understand.
If you'd only been at the table with us last week, that number would have probably been correct, but with all the minds around the table. But yes, sir, you're spot on, and we'll take that suggestion and be prepared to discuss.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you too.
All right, that's on to me. As you know, I had a lot of questions on Monday and I got a few more today. But like I said, we're not going to drag it out too long.
No, you're fine.
First, after looking at it on Monday and then again today, how would this affect schools such as Daniel Jenkins, Liberty Hill? How would they receive their allocation?
That's a great question, Mr. Calhoun. It's around program schools. And I'm assuming that you would expand that to Centers for Advanced Studies as well. That's on our list. That's one of the idiosyncrasies that we have not worked out yet in regards to this model. Those program schools typically serve, not 100% across the board, transient populations of students. So the question is, how do we do this there? So we're still working on that. We don't have the answer yet.
Okay. Second, Mr. Craven, got you. It's basically the same question I asked Mr. Brigman the other day about, are you getting ready for addressing different systems or processes that you're going to need when something like this will roll out, that will come on your end?
So the contract system that we're working is already funded and taken care of. So there's not an impact. It's already been rolled into this. So there's not an extra impact.
And we don't anticipate a lot. We've discussed with Mrs. Carlin. We don't anticipate, again, the CBOs, most of the CBOs in this ESSER process, were filtered through schools to us. So we don't anticipate a whole lot of vendors and that sort of thing in this process. Principals seem to really want, for the most part, resources, wraparound services, et cetera, through social workers and those sorts of things that they found beneficial and they could link to student outcomes. So we don't anticipate a huge need for procurement's involvement in this process as we needed early on in the launch of ESSER, if that makes sense. But certainly the need may come, and Mr. Craven and his team will, I'm sure, be ready to help.
And that actually falls directly into my next question, looking at the measurability, like with Ms. Roberts and whatnot. I know one issue that we have with particularly with ESSER 3 funds of actually continually looking at the impacts that we're actually being had, and looking at it from the beginning to the middle to out to where we're at the end, we're trying to scramble and grab all the data. How often are we going to measure whether, say, if somebody at Styles Point, they put up one FTE, we don't, how are we going to measure their success and the impact on the students?
So we're
and how
working,
often?
we're working on the measurability of this now and determining with associate superintendents how we should measure. We've certainly had preliminary conversations about how that will go. There's been a suggestion that we might do program impact reports on these types of things every year, because this is a significant budgetary contribution, to the GOF. And so we'll have to annually assess the success of related positions or programs to the overall effectiveness of the organization. Quite frankly, it's really how we should do work and are doing work in many instances. For example, student learning objectives, SLOs, are established in all of our schools with our teachers to help track student progress and their effectiveness. And so we have to figure out processes like that to annually assess the effectiveness of all of these things. And so we're working on that. We don't have all the details worked out yet. I would not be honest if I said we did, but we're working hard.
Okay. And I'm sure before we start putting together the different models or whatnot, then a lot of it will be complete.
So I can't promise that by the time we put together models that we'll have measures in place to measure these things next year. I can't. I know we're working on that. Will we know how this impacts program schools? Yes. Will we know what things are in overlaid positions that maybe should be in the base student formula? Yes. We'll know things that directly impact the budget, but in regards to having the assessment measures completely worked out, we won't have that worked out. But we'll also have that set of guardrails to which Ms. Stamp and Michael referred earlier. We'll have those things worked out because our principals, with the interest of our board on Monday night, I think Ms. Waters asked a question about how soon we were going to get to work with teachers. We started work with principals. We started work with principals the very next day. And then associates are on calls with them now. Some were on calls last night, and tomorrow we'll meet with them again at lead. So we'll have guardrails in place, and we'll know fiscal impacts in regards to programs by then. But I don't know that by the second reading of the budget or the first reading of the budget in May that we'll have the measurement work.
Cool.
That for validity and reliability, that takes some time. So we want to be real with that, and we want to make sure it's done well.
All right, let's go ahead and finish off the last couple slides.
Super. I'll run through these next, this next one or two and ask Ms. Foxworth to talk about early learning. Since she's still here with us, thank you, Ms. Foxworth, for your leadership. And then Mr. Prentice to carefully or quickly go through the last few slides. Slide 25 is school support considerations. We've got a line item there for 1.5 million for any mid-year adjustments for the enrollment. Every day we make 12 or 15-day adjustments, typically 12, but we have noted in our feedback from principals that we need to look mid-year at how schools are being impacted by the influx of students. Expanding AVID, the summer internship to which I referred earlier, student support for chronic absenteeism. We've also noted some improved student gains around employee daycare. So pilot down in District 20. We've got one going over in District 10, West Ashley. We have a budget line item here to expand to North Charleston next year due to some of the work the Joint Commission is doing over there with Councilman Darby. On the next slide, 26, we have some critical need operation things that have gone unfunded for numerous years that Mr. Baroe has identified as critical needs with his team and principals. We've got a line item there for constituent board pay. We certainly value their support. They do a lot of work with our children and families, and that leadership pipeline to which I referred early as we're preparing the next wave of leaders for those of us who are readying ourselves for retirement. Mrs. Foxworth will go over slide 27 really quickly in regards to early learning. Ms. Foxworth.
Sure, I'm going to go line by line very quickly. Expanded Head Start, early Head Start. Over the last couple of years with ESSER funding, we were able to provide those families with Kaleidoscope. It has been very successful to allow them to continue to go to school or to work. We particularly have one of our pilot sites in St. James Santee, and that's been very successful because they don't have to try to come all the way back and forth. The next one is CERDEP funds. We've been a CERDEP district for the last 3 years, and what we've realized is every time our salaries go up, which we're very thankful for teachers, unfortunately, the state's funding for us has not gone up. We get $5,100 per child, and that does not cover the number of teachers we have, even though we generate close to $4.5 million from the state. And so that's just a placeholder for if we don't have enough money to cover based on the money we generate from the state. CERDEP, we did bring over some to shore up the Head Start program and offer more early Head Start sites. We did transition last year some of those classes from Head Start to CERDEP. And so the teachers were funded through CERDEP, and those are the teacher assistants that we did in ESSER. And then the project specialist, who is the main person who brings in that $4.5 million. The CD expansion, over the last 3 years out of ESSER, we've added 250 more students. And so that's allowing us to continue to serve that. And then in 2019, we had a early childhood task force. And one of the commitments that came out of the task force was the board committed at that time to match the Head Start funding so we can transition from non-certified to certified teachers. And then the last thing is, that's the total. Yep, so I went line by line.
Thank you, Ms. Foxworth. Send it over now to Mr. Prentice and Ms. Carlin to wrap us up with the next steps to balance, which I think Mrs. Roberson, you and Mr. Grabowski had asked about this.
Sure, and I don't want to repeat myself. So a couple of those things that I addressed to answer your questions, let me know if there's any further that you're seeking on that. But we're already working on the objective ways to trim $8 million across the GOF. So hope to be able to bring detailed specifics on that in April to Audit and Finance and to the budget workshop. We talked about the opportunity to reallocate millage between debt and operating and what that would bring. Just objectively, and I understand it's not a tax decrease, it's still the same millage levy. But in the debt fund, the 6% and the 4% properties throughout the county's jurisdiction are subject to the debt levy. And if you move millage over to the operating levy, those 4% properties would no longer be subject to that levy. And so it would be a tax decrease for 4% properties in the county, which could be viewed as positive. We're looking at some different ways that we can refinance and refund our outstanding obligations. In particular, there's a 2010 series IPRB that may be refunded later this year, and just also some restructuring to smooth annual principal and interest payments. And again, just talking about state and local revenues and considering increases that we'll be able to ascertain between now and the next month. I touched on reassessment, and really what that's key to is understanding how the revenue analysis that we've done and looking at prior reassessment in 2020 impacts what will happen in fiscal year 2026 to let that drive our new 3-year financial plan. And we'll be able to bring that back to the board, both in consideration of the revenue forecast and the expenditure forecast based on the board's priorities. And on the last slide, we just have the calendar of upcoming events. So next meeting being April 9th, Audit and Finance.
All right, let's finish it off. Do we have Ms. Roberson?
So, Mr. Prentice, the 3-year projection financial plan will be coming to the board in April as well?
Yes, ma'am. Well,
so Mrs. Roberson, I know you directed that to Mr. Prentice. I'm not sure that we'll have a full 3-year plan at that time. It is our goal to have a 3-year plan for the board, but we certainly are trying to plan out how any impacts to millage, et cetera, would impact this as the board considers. Again, a 3-year plan by the April meeting would be a little ambitious in its entirety for the board.
Yeah, I agree. I was just asking. Thank you.
No. I appreciate you asking. We'll do our best. We will do our best, but I would want it to be thorough and right rather than I don't want to put too much. I don't want Mr. Prentice to quit before he starts. If you know what I mean.
I agree. Thank you.
All I was going to say was just the revenue piece of it is probably, I'm going to say, easier to define than the expenditure side is, because there's so much fluctuation in those assumptions. So we'll do our best to be able to bring more data as we go through the process.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Grabowski.
No, I have no more questions. I appreciate staff. It was a very good job.
Thank you, Ms. Stamp.
No additional questions. Thank you.
Michael,
Nothing further at this time.
Mr. Duke.
No, I'm good.
No additional comments. Thanks.
Y'all gonna make me do this? No, I'm just fine. No, I actually only have one comment. Most of my I think most of my questions will be answered possibly at the board, and then moving forward as we get into the April audit and finance meeting, because like you said, we just need more numbers so we can start getting down to it. But as we work towards the April audit and finance meeting, as well as even the March board meeting, can we start putting? I know you can't promise anything, but can we start getting like a bit of a timeline of, all right, so at the April 9th Audit and Finance Committee meeting, we hope to have this. At the budget workshop, we hope to present this, so that way people won't be thinking, I should be receiving one thing, but no, I'm only getting this right here. So let's just try to break it down like all right, by this day we should have this, and just start rolling things out. And if it changes, it changes, you know.
So let us talk internally so we can determine exactly when some of those last projections are coming in, and we can let the board know that maybe as early as this Friday in the board brief, and certainly we'll share that with the audit finance. Ms. Tanisha, we'll share that with the Audit and Finance Committee too. But let me get with Ms. Carlin and Mr. Prentice and just determine what's doable. Certainly by the August, we plan to present a staff or a CCSD recommendation to the board in one of those scenarios.
April?
What did I say?
You said August.
I'm sorry. There are a lot of A's today.
Data by August.
Sorry, I didn't sneak it by, Mr. Broey. Dog. Yes, sir, April. That's exactly what I mean.
Yeah. All right.
Mr. Calhoun, let me just say this, Ms. Huggins, thank you. I appreciate talking through this before we actually look at numbers. I think last year we looked at numbers and tried to talk through it. This has been much better looking at words and talking through it. And then we look forward to getting the numbers in April. So thank you and your staff.
Thank you too, Mr. Robertson. We really appreciate that. And we are really grateful for the thoughtful questions around it, because it helps us to have multiple thought partners who think differently than we do, to help, frame of elected officials, really smart people with numbers in the room, and educators. So we know working together, we will hopefully make the board proud when we come back in April, Mr. Calhoun, not August.
But all right, cool. We're gonna go ahead and move forward to 7A. We have an executive session item. So if you're not supposed to be in here, let's go ahead and step out so we can get this contractual matter issue when we come back out with the action for it. Thank you. We will now, excuse me, I'm sorry. I apologize. Do we have a motion to go into executive session?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor say aye.
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 Aye. We are now officially in executive session. right, we are back, and you get a motion to convene an open session.
So
Motion.
moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
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 You so well, the ayes have it. We are now back into open session, where we will vote on the executive session content. Is there a motion to approve the negotiation of the real estate contracts not to exceed the staff recommendation as presented in executive session?
So moved.
So moved.
We have a
Second.
motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
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 The ayes have it. Thank you. We're gonna move forward to the items for the board meeting. Nisha's not here. We will move forward, the action items as well as the information items that we will go through quickly as opposed to, as well as the information item. All right. Furthering that, we will go to 11A. Our next meeting will be April the 9th of 2024. Any further information for the things that are good?
You did say 7A as well.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the most important ones. Yes, I forgot. 7A as well. So again, that'll be 2A, B, C, 5A, B, C, D, as well as 7A. All right. Hearing nothing further, we entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right. Thank you all. We appreciate you, and thank you all for being flexible with me as